A two-sentence interaction between two characters in a Pedro Almodovar film from 30 years ago called All About My Mother has stuck with me these 3 decades. And I wrote this story based on those two lines. They loved their bichon frisé. George, a retired truck driver, never thought he'd be the kind of guy to fall in love with a little white dog that looked like it had been fluffed up by a blow dryer. But Souvenir wasn't fragile. She had a solid build. She was no German Shepherd, of course, but she wasn't a shivering, yappy teacup dog either. She was big for her breed, a muscular 13 pounds and feisty. The Bichon was a French breed, so he and Michelle wanted to give her a French name. They'd found her on vacation 8 years earlier while staying in an Airbnb on the outskirts of Nashville. She'd been abandoned, her hair matted, one eye clamped shut from an infection. She timidly approached the porch of their little guest cottage to beg food. And after a few scraps of steak, she let George pick her up. Her ribs and spine stood out prominently. George and Michelle were legally required to make an effort to find her home, but figured if the owners couldn't be bothered to keep her safe, they didn't deserve her. So the couple took her home, a memento of their vacation, more valuable and certainly more lovable than any trinket. Souvenir loved her daily walks. As George fixed his coffee and put on his shoes, she'd sit by the door, trembling with anticipation. When he'd approach with the leash, she'd start jumping, then become as still as a statue when he clipped it on. Every day, they walked the grid of streets in their neighborhood a little differently, but always past the cafe on the corner called Les Oubliettes, where the manager would be setting out tables and chairs on the sidewalk. He always had a treat for Souvenir. Michelle liked to joke that the dog and the cafe complemented one another. In French, souvenir means to remember, and les oubliettes are little things forgotten. If one ceased to exist, the other would just disappear. This morning, George was enjoying the weather, marveling at the beauty of the occasional aspen, golden among the dominant oaks, their leaves brown and brittle under his feet. He smiled to himself as he took in the familiar smell of wood burning nearby, the smoke and chill bracing his lungs. Fall had always been his favorite time of year, but he knew winter was coming too fast, and he worried about some of his plants. Souvenir, not surprisingly, was smelling everything, even though she knew she wouldn't be allowed to stop. This morning, they went further than usual, but she always knew exactly where they were because of the smell. Even when George walked 10 miles from home, even if she didn't know the neighborhood from memory, she would pick up a scent a mile away in the direction of home, and from there, she'd pick up another scent. She always knew which direction home was located. George just wandered amiably, glad in the moment. They turned the corner onto their street, and Souvenir began tugging. As they approached home, Michelle and Barbara were waiting. Barbara hugged George tightly, relieved. "I'm sorry," he said with as much charm as he could muster. He didn't want to offend the woman. She was quite pretty and reminded him of someone. "Have we met?" "Of course we have, Dad. I'm your daughter," Barbara reminded him, as she did every time she saw him the last few months. He smiled in a kind but patronizing disbelief, as if she were the only one not to know that she had lost her mind. He went inside to feed the dog. "Mom, how could you let him wander off like that? They could get lost." Michelle sighed. Your father may not remember where he lives, but souvenir always brings him home. Please rise now in body or in spirit for number 91 in the Gray Hymnal, riding through Montreal on electric scooters. And we passed a bistro called Les Oubliettes. Now, I know the verb oublier means to forget. And I know that any noun ending with et conveys that the thing is small or diminutive. And it's often used as a term of endearment. It's kind of like ending a name or a noun with ita or ito in Spanish. So les oubliettes is a verb with a noun ending, which made it really interesting to me as a word. It's kind of poetic, maybe even a bit romantic. I figured it had to do with the precious little things that we forget, the things that may not be in our conscious minds, but still with us in our lives, in our beings, maybe even living in our cells and we don't know it. And then I started to doubt myself and thought, maybe it's slang for something that I'm not getting. Now, even though my Uncle Luc is 20 years older than I and very, very formal in his speech, I figured as a local, he'd be more connected to slang than I am. So in my curiosity, I pulled up alongside him and asked, Manon, qu'est-ce que c'est une oubliette? And he did the most French thing I've ever seen in my life. And then he just stared at me blankly and said, I don't know what you mean. So I described to him the bistro we passed, and he talked through the etymological process I'd just gone through mentally. And he confirmed my rationale. So they made up the word, I asked? It's very poetic. And he said, no, I suppose it's a real word. It's just one I've never heard of. It just sounded bizarre when you asked. And that evening, back at Luc's apartment, Joe showed me an internet meme. It was a 1980s photograph of a kid holding this big 16-inch square piece of sheet metal with the words Hall Pass painted on it. We both completely forgotten about junior high and high school hall passes. And I suddenly remembered a teacher in junior high who used a tree stump as a hall pass. This wasn't just like a little bit of wood. This was a stump. It was big and heavy. It was so large that you'd occasionally see some poor little tiny 7th grade girl sitting on it, exhausted. And I laughed out loud. It was a precious little memory that brought me joy in that moment. Une oubliette, I thought. It made me think about the many different kinds of things that we remember for decades, like a first kiss, the name of our favorite teacher, the street we grew up on, the first car, the pet names parents had for each other, the best meal or bottle of wine or chocolate lava cake we've ever had. And these are the kinds of memories that never stop giving pleasure. But then there's something magical about the little things we forget and then remember again. We never really worry about missing them because we don't know we've forgotten them. So when they come back, like that memory of that girl sitting on a log in a school corridor, there's something somehow better than they were in the original moment. They're wistful, poignant, romantic. Probably the best kind of oubliette, I think, is a smell because our most intense memories are olfactory. Like a few weeks ago, I saw a painting of a can of Play-Doh. And even though I hadn't thought about the stuff in forever, and even though it was only a painting of a can of Play-Doh, that scent came back to me so strongly, I could taste it. And instantly, I was transported back to kindergarten. And Miss Chamberlain, who returned from the holidays with a new hairstyle and a new last name. A name I can't for the life of me remember, probably because I didn't want to remember it then. Some things, of course, we try to forget, maybe even convince ourselves that we have forgotten. Things like bad breakups, ugly conflicts at work, acts of violence perpetrated against us or people we love, military battle, illness, the pain of giving birth, an endless stream of mass shootings, lies told by people we should be able to trust. So that brings up the real meaning of the word oubliette. It turns out that les oubliettes aren't precious little things forgotten. Not at all. I looked it up shortly after Joe showed me that hall pass picture. An oubliette is a prison cell. It's a very specific kind of prison cell, a dark subterranean dungeon for solitary confinement. In the medieval period, oubliettes were just basements in the castles of Europe. They were forgotten places. But during the Renaissance, they were used for torture, the kind of torture usually reserved for religious heretics. People were just thrown into them and often forgotten. Cartographer, physician, theologian, and Unitarian martyr Michael Servetus probably lived in an oubliette before he was burned alive atop a pile of his own books in 1553. It's not quite so romantic now, is it? Or maybe it is, depending on how you feel about our Christian roots. If I look back on everything I've remembered and everything I've tried to forget, I'd say that probably the worst of the lost memories are the little ways in which I forgot who I was and betrayed myself. You probably know what I mean. I'm talking about those times when, in order to preserve the peace or just to get along, or worse, just to get ahead, we betray ourselves. We sell ourselves to the highest, or sometimes even the lowest bidders, in the hopes that some good will come to us, or the principles that we're espousing. It usually isn't until much later that we discover how high the cost really was. That's got to be the worst feeling. So here's an example. It probably sounds overly dramatic, but I've never eaten at Chick-fil-A because of their politics. I have no interest in spending my money at a business that will turn around and use that money to defend their right of free association and speech, to discriminate against people like me. And if I ever ate there, that would be the worst kind of selling myself out that I'd want to forget. Trading in my sense of self-worth for what I'm sure isn't much different from a chicken sandwich that I could get anywhere. Shame lives in the little places we try to forget. The things we want to remain in the dark, never to be seen by anyone. Those memories live in the oubliettes that we build within ourselves. The most heartbreaking kind of forgetting, I think, must be dementia. Years ago, I would regularly visit a congregant. He was a World War II veteran who was approaching 100 years old, beloved by other members of the congregation. Each time I would introduce myself as if it was our first time meeting. Early on, he had great memories of the congregation and people he loved. But as happens with Alzheimer's, he lost his memory backward. First, he forgot the most recent events, like what he had for lunch. Then he forgot his retirement, then his grandchildren, then his children, his wife. And finally, he forgot his childhood. Whenever I'd leave, he'd say, "It was lovely visiting. Remind me again how we're related." It was charming, but heartbreaking to see his life, his very identity slip away from him little by little. And when he forgot his mother, he died within days. There was nothing left to him. But while he still had some memories and friends around help him keep engaged in conversation and activities, it was okay. He was happy. Because like George, who managed to walk that little Bichon Frise every day, the repetitive activities continued to give his life purpose and meaning, joy, belonging, comfort, security for the rest of his life. That's why it's so important to pay attention to the little things that we do every day, the things that connect us to our loved ones and the world around us. They are the habits of the heart that theologian James K.A. Smith calls everyday liturgies. Those little daily activities are the actions that will keep our minds engaged rather than locked away in the dungeon of lost memories. But it takes paying attention to each moment to keep them alive. It's funny how the rituals of everyday life are never really forgotten, no matter how much memory we lose. They're stored in our muscles, and ultimately, those are the things that end up giving our lives meanings. They form who we are. They make manifest the things that we value, and ultimately stay with us long after everything else is gone. That 100-year-old veteran never forgot how to be a friend, even after he forgot who his friends were. Because being a friend, that was his daily practice. It formed the rituals that in turn formed him. For Christians, the rituals that define a community are important because they're constant reminders of who they are. The most important daily ritual of an active Christian is prayer. The intention of prayers of gratitude, petition, and praise is what it becomes so deeply embedded in every action of everyday life that even after they've forgotten everything, including the people who belong to them, they never forget who they belong to. That's one of the primary comforts of Christian prayer. No matter what, you never stop belonging, and you know you belong because of the rituals that you engage in together, especially prayer. And for Buddhists, the ritual is a little different, but no less significant. The daily act of meditation, the practice of simply being in the moment, is one of paying close attention to posture and breath. The goal is to suspend regret and rumination about the past, to resist worrying about the future, and to make mental space for truth to find its way into the mind. Every moment matters, especially this moment, right now. For us Unitarian Universalists who believe that we humans are co-creators of the universe, along with other beings, the moment, this very moment, is of ultimate importance. This moment, if we bring into it everything that has made us who we are, has the potential to become anything in the future. The more we carry with us from the past, the more we learn from it. Even if we've forgotten everything we knew, everything we've learned is still part of us because it changed us, even if only imperceptibly, like how to be a good friend. But for those practices to become the habits of the heart that form our identities, they have to actually be practices. Not things that we do perfectly, but things that we do regularly with intention and attention. Things that we practice. We don't necessarily engage in prayers that ask for help from God. Most of us, after all, don't believe in that God. But we do, or at least we should, engage in the kind of being in the moment that cultivates gratitude for the abundance of our lives, activates reverent awe for the world around us, and seeks to be reflective so that it generates insight and maybe even a little bit of humility. We have to make regular practice of letting go of regret and worry so that we can make honest assessments of ourselves and take the first steps in becoming the better people we want to be, better co-creators of the universe. That's what I think is so cool about being part of a faith community like this one. We can practice being together, being in the world, being co-creators, even if we don't always get it right. even if it's messy, we aren't perfect. But really, we're not going for perfect, are we? We're going for good enough. Good enough to show that we care and have made an effort. May our efforts become our identities, and may those identities stay with us as precious memories that live in the habits of our hearts long after they become the precious things that we've forgotten. May it be so. Please